was the first. Before that, the Christians were persecuted. We've probably read about the history about the Christians hiding in the caves under the city and so forth. But when Constantine became emperor, he was the first Roman emperor to accept Christianity. Now, some scholars have their doubts whether he was a true Christian or not. We don't know the answer to that. He may have. But he had some other reasons for supporting the Christians. One, he saw that the Christians as a group were growing in considerable number. And as emperor, he would like to keep things flowing smoothly in Rome and in the papal state. I don't know how much you can see from the map, but you see the boot down in the bottom where Italy is, down in the center of the map. I can't see either, but the bottom part I think is Naples, and then go up the boot a little bit, you see the blue part. That was called the Papal States. That's where Rome is, and that is the area where the church was really centered in Rome. And I won't say that the Roman emperor didn't. He covered a lot of that area in the Mediterranean, but the Papal States was where he had his concentration of power. And as most rulers go, he wanted more land and more power and more wealth. It's a story of history and mankind. And he figured if he could get the Christians on his side, one, it would be smoother everyday life in Rome, less opposition. Also, if he got the Christians on his side, he wouldn't have to fight them, and they would hopefully support him because he had accepted them. And so he had more people to outnumber his opposition. And so that went on for some time. And then in about 1056, something happened called the Great Schism. And you'll notice on the map where Italy was. That's where they had several popes over the time. They were the leaders of the Roman Catholic Church. We became known as the Roman Catholic Church because they were in Rome, obviously. And they controlled a good portion of the southern Mediterranean. But can you see where the Ottoman Empire is in the Black Sea, up in the north, in the right column? Right below that is the city of Constantinople. It was named for Emperor Constantine. And because of distance, he was in Rome. They had another man in Constantinople, or that area, who sort of looked after the church in the eastern area, and they called him the Patriarch. So you had two leaders of the Christian church, the Roman Christian church, and they got in a debate. It was a power struggle. Each one wanted to have their say, and eventually the Roman Pope sent a man to Constantinople, we know as Istanbul, and the Patriarch wouldn't see him for 2 weeks, let him sit on his heels. And so anyway, what the result was, they couldn't agree. Each man wanted the power, and neither one wanted to answer to the other man. So the Eastern Patriarch said, okay, that's where you feel, we'll just split. So that meant that the Roman Catholic Church split everything from Italy, north and west, remained in the Roman Catholic Church. And everything you see in the lower green, Greece was to the right of Italy. The Greeks all the way over and northeast became the Eastern Orthodox Church. And today, that exists primarily the Greek Orthodox Church based in Greece and the Russian Orthodox Church, which I think is split off of the Greeks. But anyway, they practice Christianity in their own way, but those two groups divided completely. So let's go on up through the years a little bit later and into the 1500s. And to put it in perspective, We know that Columbus, the Italian sailor, at the bid of the Spanish crown, went to America in 1492. So this was a little bit later in the 1500s, that there was a man in one of the German states named Martin Luther. And he was the man that sparked the Reformation. Martin Luther was a Catholic priest, but he began studying a lot, and he got it. By that time, they had the printing press, and that was a revolutionary thing. Think about your ancestors in 1900 still riding horses and buggies, and if somebody had showed them a copy machine that didn't require electricity, think of what they could do with letters and newspapers and so forth. So Martin Luther may have translated some himself, but he got a hold of a Greek and Latin Bible, and he was able to read the scriptures in something new, especially in the Greek language maybe. He was able to read more and learn more of the Bible, and he began to see things in the Bible that he hadn't been taught or hadn't learned before. And at the same time, one of the Roman emperors allowed something to happen. I've got to explain the difference between the emperor and the Pope. The Pope was in Rome. He controlled the Roman Catholic Church, and he was a very, very powerful man. At the same time, the emperor, as we know, the Roman emperors had sort of ceased. They lost a lot of power, but what remained in the 1500s was the Holy Roman Emperor. And if you look at the map, can you go back to the map, Belinda? Okay. France is pretty much its own nation. Spain, England's across the water, over danger. But look in the center of Europe, all those colorful states. From Italy north, Austria, most of Germany was considered the Holy Roman Empire. The reason they're so small was they had not developed in a cohesive nation, and they wouldn't until 1871. France was strong enough of their king to be a large nation. And look at Poland and Lithuania, that was a huge land. But the German states were basically independent little states, as you will, each with their own prince or a king here, a king there, but they owed allegiance to the Holy Roman Emperor, who was selected by a group of men, council. And so that was more of the political side of things, whereas the Pope held the religious side of things, but they worked fairly well together. But the Pope at the time, I think it was Leo, he wanted to rebuild what was called St. Peter's Cathedral, not the one that you see on television in Rome today. That's a new one. But there's an older building. It wasn't very nice. It needed a lot of renovation, etc. Where was the money coming from? He needed extra money. And so he teamed up with a fellow in Germany who was one of these small princes, let's say, and this same man who was a prince also bought his way into becoming a bishop. He borrowed money from the banking group called the Fuggers, an enormous sum of money, I don't know how much, and he was able to buy his job. If you got money, money talks, and he was able to become a bishop. Once he became the bishop, I assume he got a salary. But he had this outstanding loan, and he needed to pay it off. So he worked out a deal with the Pope. He said, we're going to come up with a scheme to sell indulgences. And the Pope said, you got my go-ahead, you split the profits with me. So what it amounted to, and it wasn't everywhere, but it probably did expand over time throughout the Holy Roman Empire. This fellow in Germany would send out salesmen from town to town, and they'd go in the town square and they would start telling the people, we know that you have committed sins because we've heard you tell of your sins in church. They had to confess their sins. we will offer you not salvation, but a redemption. And they had a man with a table sitting out there in the town square, and you come by and you pay us, I don't know what the money was, but let's say in today's terms, if you give us $25, we'll give you a printed piece of paper which says we authorize that the church will give you redemption for your sins. And the Roman Catholics believed in a place called purgatory. When you die, and obviously if you're a sinner, or maybe not a sinner, you go to a place called purgatory, and you sit there. And then I guess they believe when Christ arrives again that you'll be judged and you'll move out of purgatory and go to heaven or go to hell. But I'm not sure about the details of that, but that's something they believe. Of course, it's not in the Bible. But this is the scheme they hooked up. And here's the deal. They could tell Johnny Jones right here, Johnny, we know you're a sinner. If you give us $25, we'll give you a certificate. You're redeemed from that sin. You're more or less forgiven of that sin, but not salvation. And oh, by the way, Johnny, we know that your uncle that died last month was a thief. If you give us another $25, we will pray him out of purgatory. And oh, by the way, your grandfather killed a man 10 years ago, and he's in purgatory. Give us another $25, and we'll raise him up out of purgatory and redeem him. So that was it. And it brought money to this German prince, and it brought money to the Pope so he could build the church. Well, the Catholic Church kept getting more powerful. It was a big, and it is today, a huge bureaucracy. The popes over the years like to buy paintings, and I mean they like to buy the most expensive works of art that the greatest artists of Europe painted, and they would display them all in the cathedrals and the churches and so forth, and that cost a lot of money. But anyway, Martin Luther began to look at these indulgences, and he said, this is not right. And studying the Bible, he said, there's nothing in the Bible about giving people repentance by buying their way. And I think furthermore, he said, this thing of purgatory isn't right either. So Martin Luther was a young man who was studying hard and reading the Bible. And he also said, man should be able to read the Word and come to speak to God himself. So you have heard, and when you went to school perhaps, about the 95 theses. He went to a nearby church door and he took his hammer and he nailed this list of 99 theses he wrote out. And one person who was telling about this said over time, throughout the history, that hammer got bigger and bigger and bigger. But anyway, the story is he did nail to the church door. He didn't intend for it to be a reformation, but it became that. The theses themselves were not that awful striking. In that day and time, you could put on a display of something in public, and what you were doing, you were inviting other scholars, and most of the higher church people and the aristocracy were the only ones that were educated. They could have a public debate over these matters, and that's pretty much what he wanted, was to have a debate over those theses. But he did condemn the people paying to redeem their sins. Well, that started the ball rolling, and people began to hear about it because this became a news item in the printing press, and it did get into other nations and states. And Martin Luther, by the way, lived from 1483 to 1546. About that time, this word started getting out. There was another man named Ulrich Zwingli. He was in Switzerland, and he got a hold of the Bible. He was a priest as well. He sort of went the same road as Martin Luther. He began reading the Bible, and he began disagreeing with the church. And also John Calvin was a Frenchman who, same thing happened. He started reading, studying. Let me get back to Ulrich Zwingli. he was an educated man in Switzerland, and you had three basic towns. Bern is today the capital. Basel is at the top corner where France, Switzerland, and Germany meet. And then Zurich was a little bit over to the east, but south of Germany. They were German-speaking. Ulrich Zwingli went through this process of learning and thinking and studying, as did Martin Luther. And John Calvin did the same. Here are three men who began to say, we don't agree with everything that this Roman Catholic Church is pronouncing. We disagree. And through biblical study, they realized there's a difference here. And so it wasn't any one person, but here are three men, two in Switzerland, one in Germany, and the word spread that people were dissatisfied with the Roman Catholic Church and the teachings. And Ulrich Zwingli is credited with founding the Swiss Reformed Church. Anytime you hear Reformed, it basically means people who left the Catholic Church to form what we call Protestant. And you had the Dutch Reformed, you had the French Reformed, and so forth. John Calvin, as an interesting fellow, he not only was educated tremendously in Paris and other places, he was trained as a scholar. That's what he wanted to be. He was also trained as a lawyer. And I think he became a priest as well. But things were getting hot politically for those who were criticizing the Catholic Church, so he fled France and went to Switzerland. And that's where he began a movement. But John Calvin didn't necessarily start a church. There was no Calvin church, unlike Martin Luther. And then I have to switch gears back to Martin Luther. Martin Luther did not wish to leave the Catholic Church. He only wanted to reform it. He knew that these indulgences were wrong. He believed that people should be able to speak and pray to God on their own, and they should be able to read the Bible on their own. So he started what became the Lutheran Church. And if you look on, I'll talk, not look at the map. Today, the Lutheran Church is very strong in the northern half of Germany, in all the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and some in Finland. They are strongly Lutheran churches. They are basically the state church in those nations. The Calvinist was not a church itself, but they influenced other churches. John Calvin did a lot of writing, and he, as I say, he was a very educated man, brilliant man. He came up with his theology of what we call Calvinism. The first time I heard of Calvinism was in 1978 when preacher Erwin Perea, an old preacher, was preaching in Buffalo, and he made the comment, he said, Brother Elvidge Griffin tends toward the Calvinist persuasion. Brother Walter Elliott tends toward the Arminian persuasion. True Calvinism, and I can't go into all the details because I don't know them, but they believe that God has selected what they call elect, a group of people on earth who are destined to go to heaven. And we think of the Presbyterians as being strongly in that favor. I'm going to put it this, and you correct me, Pastor, if I'm wrong. If you start in the middle and go all the way out, if you went, the Arminians went, they basically believe that all have the chance and the choice to accept Christ. If you went overboard on the Arminian system, you would become sort of Unitarian, where they would say God wants every person to go to heaven, or God allows everybody to go to heaven. But as I say, that's at the very extreme of Arminianism. At the extreme of Calvinism, they might say, well, we know this, and my buddies are the elect. We know we're bound for heaven, so we can do anything we want to because we're the elect. so let's go out tonight and shoot up the town and get drunk. See, that's an extreme. But somewhere in the middle is where Arminianism and Calvinism meet. And that's a story for somebody else another time, and I don't think we need to get involved in that. But Calvin, as I said, had a great influence on the French, the Dutch, parts of Germany, parts of Romania, and also John Knox in Scotland established the Presbyterian Church in Scotland. And when this nation was founded, many of the Scots people and the Scot-Irish came to America, and they brought with them the Presbyterian religion. That's why when you go up in the Valley of Virginia, as Belinda and I did, we went one Sunday morning looking for a church. We asked the night before. There weren't any Baptist churches in Stanton that we could find. And well, there was one, the hotel people said, well, there's Ebenezer. And we said, well, thank you, but we're not sure that's the one we want to attend. But we ended up going to a Presbyterian church. They're strong up there because the Scot-Irish came down the valley. But let's get back to Europe. All three men wanted to reform the Catholic Church. They didn't mean to leave the church, but that's sort of what happened when Martin Luther ended up with his group forming the Lutheran Church. And the Calvinists went to various Protestant churches. And Aldrich Zwingli, of course, he was killed in a battle between the Protestants and Catholics. He founded the Swiss Reformed Church. By the way, and we'll touch on this on another night, the French people who became Protestants were vastly outnumbered in France, and they were highly persecuted because the King of France was Catholic, and he wanted no part of these French Protestants. They were known, what we call Huguenots. Their French pronunciation is Huguenots. And they were so, I think there was the massacre of St. Bartholomew. Anyway, there was one evening that so many French Huguenots were massacred in one night or one day. It's like Kristallnacht when the Nazis killed so many Jews in one night. These people just had to flee for their lives, and they fled to the Netherlands and England, and many of them came here. And that's why there was a French Huguenot colony in Powhatan County on the south side of James River. And I'll probably touch more on that later, because we no doubt have many people in this community who are descended from the French Huguenots. But, as I say, they wanted to reform the church. But about that time, you had a group in Switzerland that said, this is all well and good what Calvin and Martin Luther and Zwingli are doing, but they're not going far enough. And these people in the Swiss areas were reading the Bible, and they wanted to return to what they call apostolic worship. They wanted to worship and study the Bible just as the people in the New Testament were when we read of the Apostle Paul and all the book of James and so forth. They wanted to go back to studying God with the real scripture. And they didn't believe in the indulgences. They didn't believe what was going on in the Catholic churches, and they felt like these new Protestant churches weren't strong enough either. Let me give you an example of what I saw on a video recently. There was a man in maybe a year or so ago that made a video. He was raised in New Jersey as a Roman Catholic, and that he was born that way and he was raised that way. But over time, some of his brother-in-laws, even his brothers, started reading the Bible and studying it very much. He didn't say where they went to church, but they persuaded him to read the Bible. And he said one evening he was living alone, and he looked, and there in the window was an ornamental Bible his mother had given him. It was a pretty Bible. He said he picked it up and started reading. And next thing you know, it's 4 a.m. in the morning. And he was awakened by what he read in the Bible. And so he started asking questions. He started talking with his brother-in-laws and his brother about what they read in the Bible. And I think he asked his local priest, and he didn't get anywhere, didn't get the answers he wanted. So he made an appointment with the bishop. I assume that the bishop in that part of New Jersey, or in that city, was probably in charge of several churches, I would imagine. And he had to make an appointment, so he went. He went into this large office. It was a very nice office, and there were books lined in the shelves all over. And the priest sitting behind his desk, he said, "What can I do for you? Have a seat." And he said, "Well, I have questions. I've been reading the Bible, and there are a lot of things I just don't understand. Can you help me out?" He said he wasn't trying to be confrontational. He just wanted answers. And it got to the point where the bishop said, "I don't know. Let me see if I got a Bible around here somewhere." He said hundreds of books on the shelves. That bishop couldn't put his hands on a Bible. And they continued the discussion, and finally the bishop said, I can answer all the questions you have about Catholic policy and Catholic doctrine, but I can't answer your questions about the Bible." And so the man said, "Well, I thank you for your time," got up and went on. Well, he doesn't go to that church anymore. But that's a different worldview. And these people in Switzerland were reading the Bible, and they said, "We want to go back to plain worshiping God, studying Jesus Christ, reading the scriptures that the apostles had." And one thing I will say about John Calvin, he was the most firm in wanting to cleanse the church. He didn't want statues here. He didn't want a pedestal with the Mother Mary sitting up here. They believe Mother Mary is sort of like Queen of Heaven. He didn't want gargoyles. And that came back from the Romans when they were, before Constantine accepted Christ, they had a system of paganism in which they worshiped the sun god and Zeus and all these other gods. And if you go into a Catholic church today, I've just seen pictures. I've been to one Catholic wedding, but I didn't remember anything. They'll have a sunburst all over the church as if they worship the sun. But anyway, this new group in Switzerland became what we know as Mennonites. Also the Amish. There was Joseph Almond, who led what became the Amish, the Mennonites. There was Menno Simmons. And what they advocated was going back to the Bible, keeping things simple, and doing without a lot of the extras. And they also believed, and here we have, let me back up a minute. Let me share with you what became of the first Protestant movement of Martin Luther, John Calvin, and Ulrich Zwingli. They tried to reform the Catholic Church, but they were described as magisterial reformers. That is, the Lutherans, the Calvinists, meaning the Dutch churches, the Presbyterian churches, and also the Anglican Church. You remember Henry VIII, who kicked the Roman Church out of England because he wanted to marry a certain woman. How many wives did he have? 8? Okay. Well, the Catholic Church didn't recognize divorce, and he wanted to marry this girl. So he said, "Okay, y'all get out of England. I'm going to be the head of the church." And they, of course, called it the Anglican Church for England. So Henry VIII did become the head of the church. But the magisterial reformers, Lutherans, Calvinists, and Anglicans, still kept a lot of the practices of the Catholic Church, but not the indulgences, and the Protestants did believe in reading the Bible, in sharing the Bible. But here's another thing that happened in Switzerland that Ulrich Zwingli started. He said everybody should have access to a Bible and should be able to read the Bible, because the Catholics did not want people to read the Bible. they persecuted for reading the Bible. And I don't mean they came out of Rome, but the local officials in the church in certain cities would go about, and if they heard you were reading the Bible, they go into your homes. If they found a Bible, you're in hot water. And many people were arrested, and some were actually killed because they were reading the Bible or had Bibles. So that's one thing these reformers did want. They wanted people to be able to have a Bible and to read it. But the Anabaptists, as I said, they wanted to grow a cleaner, leaner, simplified church and adhere to the Bible. They also, and here's what distinguishes the Anabaptists from the magisterial reformers. And the Anabaptists were called radical reformers. And they believed in believers' baptism, such as we, separation of church and state, and priesthood of the believers. That is, any of us can pick up a Bible and read it and make some decisions for ourselves. And the Anabaptists, that was a name. Most of these names were given by their opponents. Anabaptists would mean rebaptized. Well, the Anabaptists believed in baptism of the believer. When you make that decision, you receive Christ, and then as a recognition of your receiving Christ, we want to be baptized. So the descendants of the Anabaptists today include Baptists, the Amish, the Mennonites, the Moravians, who were just a Czechoslovakian German area, and to some degree the Quakers. That is, all these groups had similarities, and of course, we don't wear plain clothes as the Amish. We don't shun one another, and we don't hold to the pacifism of the Quakers, but all these groups had a lot of similarities. And here we're going to go more into the Anabaptists. What time is it? We still got some time. There was a man who heard Ulrich Zwingli preach, and his name was Conrad Grebel. He was a Swiss man, and he was well educated. He went to Paris to study. But as a lot of young men, he got into a lot of trouble in Paris. He had a good time, and his father wasn't happy. Well, anyway, he came back to Switzerland. But he heard the preaching of Ulrich Zwingli, and it changed him. And like a lot of young people, he went through a time where he couldn't decide what he wanted to do or where he stood. But he started reading the Bible, and then he met a girl that he really liked, and he wanted to marry her, and that may have had something to do with him settling down. One problem was that he was of upper middle class, and the parents didn't approve of the girl. She was I don't know what she was, milkmaid, servant. But evidently, he thought she was a good girl, and he ended up marrying her. But he changed and accepted Christ fully. And he was the co-founder of the Swiss Brethren, and the Brethren are not too unlike the Mennonites and the Amish. At one time, there was the Brethren Church in the Valley of Virginia, and I think they later merged with the Methodists. But Conrad Grebel didn't live a long life. He'd had some illness, but he achieved a whole lot in 4 years when he helped found the Swiss Brethren, and he also was an evangelist throughout Switzerland as one of the Anabaptists. And then, as these efforts went on, the word got out. And then we're going to head on over to England. There were two men, one Thomas Helwys, born 1575, died in 1616, that's not a long life, and John Smythe, 1554 to 1612, even shorter. They had heard of these preachings, and they read from Martin Luther, John Calvin, Ulrich Zwingli, and Conrad Grebel. And they were basically the first English Baptist. But there again, they were getting flack from the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church was the state church. Everybody in England had to belong to the Anglican Church. And I'm sure all of these state churches required you to pay taxes to the church or to the state. Just like here in Virginia in the 1700s, in Eastern Virginia, everybody was supposed to belong to the Anglican Church, and you were supposed to pay taxes to support the Anglican Church. Well, we'll talk about that later. But anyway, they were receiving so much flack for their beliefs and trying to have home services that they said, this is getting too hot. We got to get out of here. So Thomas Helwys and John Smythe got aboard a boat and went over to the Netherlands. And there they had the first group of Baptists, really, as Baptists as we know it. There's one reason they went to the Netherlands, because they had toleration for these other groups. And the reason being, the Netherlands is a small country, very flat. You've all studied in school about the floods and the flatlands that they try to reclaim. They didn't have a whole lot. They had good farmers, but not a lot of land. The Dutch made their living with shipping and trading. When I was reading about Peter the Great, when he visited the Netherlands in the late 1600s, Amsterdam was the richest city in all of Europe and probably in the world, because they shipped goods all over the world. They traded. Even in the 1980s, the Netherlands was the #1 exporter of soybeans from the U.S. They didn't use them. They sold them to somebody else. But I'm just giving an example. And because of the trading, the Netherlands has always had a policy of being a little more hospitable to your guests and to your new immigrants in there. So they allowed the Baptists to freely practice. But Thomas Helwys and John Smythe eventually decided this is not really the place for us. One, they didn't want the children who were English speaking to grow up learning Dutch. And if they went to school, they'd have to learn Dutch. And the customs were a little different. It just wasn't the same as in merry old England. So they sort of went back to England, and they did establish an English Baptist church, where they established a church in Holland, but they went back to England and established a church, their first Baptist church in England. Well, Helwys stayed with it, but John Smythe, he got to thinking and sorting out things in his mind, and he went back to Holland and joined the Mennonites. So you just see people have different thoughts in their heads, and but Thomas Helwys did stay with the Baptist Church of England. And let's see what we have about the first English Baptist church. Number one, they believed in personal conversion and believers' baptism, just as we do. Two, they believed in the independence of each local church. Prior to that, and I have to go back and tell about the Reformed Protestant churches, they believed in a state church. Martin Luther and John Calvin believed that their Reformed churches, the Protestant churches, should cooperate with the state. They wanted each nation or each state or principality, whatever it may be, to help run the churches, help tax and coordinate and discipline. Everything should be shared with the state. So I'm not familiar with the Lutheran churches, except in America, most Germanic people or German immigrants tend to go there because that's where they had in Europe. But they are a larger body. But these early Baptists thought, no, they looked back to the Bible as we've studied in the New Testament. Remember when Paul went to all these little towns in his journeys, and even the books of the Bibles, the name, everyone had a congregation. You remember Paul was writing these letters and telling the people in this town, stay firm, stick to your convictions, watch out for false teachers, etc. So the English wanted to do the same. They didn't mind if somebody started a church across town in the next town, but they thought each one of them should remain independent. And thus that started what we follow today. We have a lot in common with Orange Creek and Nelson and Norfolk, but we remain independent as we choose our own pastor and deacons. And we answer to God, but we do not answer to a higher body of people. Number 3, the English Baptists believed in support of complete religious liberty. They did not want to be part of the state. They did not want to pay taxes to the Anglican Church. They wanted to be able to, whether they worshiped in a church building or in Bob Smith's home, it mattered not. They should be left alone. As long as they didn't bother somebody, they should be able to worship together. And as I just said, the last pastors and deacons were selected by the local congregation. So that's the first English church, and I think it's probably time for me to stop tonight. Next time, we've got another printout which will be on the screen. We'll look at Roger Williams, Dr. John Clarke, Reverend Obadiah Holmes. We'll discuss the Great Awakening, and then hopefully by the third Sunday, we'll get down here in Virginia. So, any questions? Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Is it true that the Catholic Church still teaches or preaches in Latin or whatever? So people didn't understand what they were saying.
I'm just from grapevine gossip, I hear that some Catholic churches do preach in English, here in the U.S. at least.
How about then they were doing it?
Oh, it was entirely Latin. And exactly. If you were in Germany, well, I guess we have to go back. Latin was a very well-used language. My grandmother taught Latin in school because that was a requirement. But Latin was first, when we're studying the Bible, today we think of Greek. Then Latin became a European language. But the common people didn't know Latin. If you were pitching hay, whether in Switzerland or Germany or England, you didn't know Latin. And you're milking the cows, you didn't know Latin. So if you went to church and they're preaching Latin, you hear the priest, but you don't have any idea what they're talking about. And the fact that the common people were not allowed to have a Bible or read the scripture, look what they were losing out on. We have that luxury, and they didn't. So, does that answer your question?
So there was no way for them to learn.
No, they couldn't. And it's hard for us to grasp how the leaders of those early churches would not allow the people to study Bible. Why did they crucify? I mean, their idea was, if you don't believe our way, off with your head, literally. I mean, we can't fathom that today, but that's part of history. Any other questions? Well, Don Loftus, would you close us in prayer, please?
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to come together to learn more about our religious freedom and how it started. We thank you for Robert and doing this study and presenting this to us tonight. We pray you to be with us through this coming week, and be especially with Alicia as she brings new life into this world this week.
All right. Well, we welcome Brother Robert tonight and leading in our last study, and looking forward to all that the Lord's put on him to share. So, Brother Robert, we welcome you.
Let's start. Dear Heavenly Father, asked me, well, not so long ago, when he did this talk a year ago, I guess. But also, I have to thank my wife, because it was roughly 2 years ago that you visited me at Duke Hospital. I had surgery. Got home, and my wife said, I wasn't supposed to do anything. And she said, why don't you do what you like and go do some research? Go to the library, go to the courthouse and all. And so that's what I've come up with to study for tonight. The previous 2 nights I've had to study at home. But we're going to shift gears tonight and talk about the people of this church and this community. Ruth gave me a nice list of the 40 members that came from from Ernst Creek Church. And there were a few that did not come from Ernst Creek Church. Emmett Willard, well, we know he was the newspaper writing school teacher who wrote eloquently in the paper. Fred Ogilvie would be Fred Ogilvie. Does anybody know? I'm guessing maybe he was going to Norfolk, but I don't know. Bill Owen is a ministry. I can't find out who Bill Owen of 1919 was. R.L. Hudson, that'd be Robert Hudson. Ryan, that'd be some of your kinfolk. J.L. Newton, Jack Newton married one of Nish Heights' daughters.
Nice.
Thank you. And the rest of them, I think a lot of the people that the church are already familiar with. And if you have any questions, we can go over that later. But I'm going to carry us back to the beginning. In the 1720s, the General Assembly of Virginia, which was still under British rule, wanted to make a survey between Virginia and North Carolina, figure out exactly where the line would be. And they commissioned William Byrd II of Westover Plantation to lead the survey. William Byrd was a unique individual. He was a very wealthy man. He built the most beautiful doorway in Virginia. He was an educated man. He read Greek every morning, spoke French and other languages. But anyway, he started at the coast and came all the way through the Dismal Swamp, all the way up here. And when he got to this area, he called it the Garden of Eden, and he wrote a book about his travels this way. He just thought it was a lovely land. Well, he got right up the road here, where there was no road, but he's a little further to the south, but they did meander off the line a little bit in Carolina and Virginia. And the first white man he met in this area was Aaron Pinson. And Aaron Pinson was an overseer for somebody else who had been given a grant of land up this way. And Miss Sandra Ruster told me, yes, Aaron Pinson was supposed to be living in a log house on her land. If y'all know where Sandra Ruster is, Garland Smith's daughter, right up there on 558. If you look up behind Garland Smith's old house, where that airstrip used to be, she said, go up the middle of the airstrip, and off the edge of the woods was where his house was. And she said either her daddy or her granddaddy had seen the remains of that old house. Well, anyway, prior to that, the name for Aaron's Creek was Tawahami. It was an Indian name. And Aaron's Creek starts in Gravel County. There's a bridge, crosses Highway 96, and it comes on up all along the way with a bunch of mills and gravel, one at Apples Mill, Highway 49, and so forth. Aaron Pinson's descendants are still around here today. If you are Owen, one of the Owens from Buffalo Junction, such as I am, you're descended from Aaron Pinson. The interesting thing is that Aaron Pinson's wife was Elizabeth Rambo, and their family goes back on the border of Sweden and Finland. But anyway, William Byrd was, for all his work, and went all the way up to the tip of Virginia and back, he was granted by the House of Burgesses 105,000 acres of land. And he chose up in this area, so it would be roughly from Aaron's Creek Church up along the creek, maybe crossing Charlotte County. Well, good ways. Well, he didn't want land up here. He sold it off at that year. But that's how Aaron's Creek got the name, because Aaron Pinson was first white man in these parts. So that was in the 1720s. This was wilderness. There was only one man up here in some Indians. You can imagine. Think of it, this community with no house or barn inside anyway, no roads. And then you had more families moving in, and three of the leading families who came up here were the Ogilvies, the Pettipools, and the Tallies. And all three of these families came mostly from eastern Virginia. They made their way up this way, and a lot of them came here from Prince George County. That seemed to be the stopping off point for people. And then when they got the urge to move west, they left Prince George, came through Brunswick County, came through present-day Lunenburg, and ended up here. There was nobody here, so they had all kind of land. They did have to buy it from the crown or from somebody else, but it was right for the taking. And most people seemed to settle along the creeks. I found a bunch of people who settled along Big Buffalo Creek between Buffalo Church and the White House. And why in the world they would settle down there in that swamp, I don't know, but I found all kind of deeds. I guess they wanted to be close to the water. The water was convenient before you had a well. But anyway, the Ogilvies and the Pettipools seem to be from Heights Mill north a bit. Seth Pettipool got a grant for 1,100 and some acres, and his land seemed to have been about where Ernst Creek Church is, and come on down. I think they probably bought some more land, and then the Ogilvies came in, and they bought land along the way, and they probably sold. I think the Pool sold some of the original land to the Ogilvies. Sylvester Ogilvie was a man that owned land on the north side of 58 where Wade Perez living now. And Sylvester Ogilvie was the ancestor of Carl and Jean and Ronnie Ogilvie and anybody else here that's an Ogilvie connected. Sylvester had a son, John Mack Ogilvie, and then John Mack had a son, I can't believe I got some. Anyway, he was the ancestor of all these Ogilvies around here. On the Pettipools, the first Pettipool here was Seth Pettipool, and they all had a lot of children. Then William Pettipool, and then William Pettipool married a times, and then they had a bunch of children, and one of them was Captain Stephen Pettipool. The Tallies were a little bit further down the creek, and there was a man, Abraham Talley, who was born in Prince George County, and he came up here with his sons. There was Frederick, John, Hilkiah, William, and let's see, left date one. It'll come to me. But anyway, Abraham Talley got grants of land, and I've seen him a plat. He owned from roughly north of the Virgin Line Elementary School to north of Red Bank Crossroads, and a good way to the east. He had something like 3,000 acres of land. And then they bought more land because I found deeds along the creek here. So let's see, what did I say? Frederick, John, Hilkiah, William, and can't think of the other one right now. But anyway, then you had another group of people that came this way from the James River area. And remember in the first study I told you about the persecution of the Calvinists and the Lutherans and the early Protestants? Well, the Calvinist Protestants in Switzerland, France, and the Netherlands were called Reformed Church. And in France, you had a group of people called, they pronounced it Huguenots, we call it Huguenots. And thousands upon thousands were murdered by the Catholic Church back then. And it was so bad that people had to leave. Some fled to Switzerland, some went to the Netherlands, and some went to England. And maybe as many as 500,000 Protestant Huguenots left France. But you have to understand something. My daddy said that the Huguenots, as a class, they were Protestants. They were your middle class. They were your small town merchants. They were textile people. They were cabinet makers, tinsmiths, any kind of hands-on occupation. For those of us who grew up everybody here grew up in the 1960s, I think. Just today, picture your downtown areas, the hardware store, the drugstore, the parts place, the plumber. Those were the Huguenots in their day. And they fled France for their lives. Because they were killed, be killed, or join the Catholic Church, or leave. So they leave. And Dad said, the cream of the crop left France and they've never been the same since. Well, the biggest contingent of French Huguenots, it came to America, and they did go to Charleston, New York, and other places. They came up the James River to Powhatan County to a place called Anglican Town. That was an Indian town, and they settled there. And if you go up there today, you'll see all these little road signs, Misha, X, and Macon, and Provost. They're all these French names all over the place. And some of the names would be, you all heard this name, Chastain, from Chastain Home, Jarnet, Falkland, also at Red Bank, your Murrays, and your Pereira's. Those were French names. These were some of the best people of France that settled on the James River. Well, they started coming down this way too. And they came for cheap land and more of it spread out. And the Wilkinson family is one. They weren't necessarily Huguenots, don't think they were, but they came from Powhatan County. My wife and I went up there a couple of weeks ago. There was no house to be seen, but we went on this little road, and that's where my 7th grade grandfather, Norman Wilkinson, was supposed to live. And one of his sons, William Wilkinson, came down here, and all the Wilkinsons that you ever heard of around here, buried at Aaron's Creek Church. Don, what's the Wilkinson Road over state line? Proclus Wilkinson? The ones in Clarksville, all around Virgin Island, Nelson, they all descended from the Wilkinsons that came from Powhatan. Just shows you how to multiply over the years. Well, let me keep on down the road here. Yes, sir.
Creek on 49 in Wilkerson.
They're all the same.
Alabama and George.
Right.
All that bunch.
All the same family. They're Dewey Wilkinson over here, same crowd. Well, so we know the Ogleds, Petticoats, and Tallows settled along the creek. Everybody settled on the creek in both counties. You could almost make a county of its own with Aaron's Creek in the middle. There was a fellow named Ambrose Gregory that obtained land along the creek down here, and he died in the, I'd say by 1820 or 30. But I found out in pool history that Ambrose Gregory was a builder. Y'all know Rebel Hill down here on 58 that Bruce Nunn bought, the big colonial house. It is said that Ambrose Gregory built that house, but he didn't stay there. And he built the mill down here. We don't know what date, but I've seen some records in Halifax book that said there was a mill there listed in the early 1800s, by 1820. I suspect it was built before then. Somewhere around 1800, he built the mill. I'm sure he had plenty of help. Had to have oxen and pulleys and labor, but he was actually a worker and a craftsman himself. But Ambrose Gregory had a couple of children, and one of his daughters married a Captain Stephen Petticoat. And Stephen Petticoat was a captain in the War 1812, and he was the son of William Poole, who was the son of Seth, who had a land grant. Well, Ambrose Gregory decided to give half of his land to his daughter, Millie, and her husband, Captain Stephen Petticoat, and later he left half to his son, Ava. Captain Stephen Petticoat had a house on the same spot, or the same yard where Grayson Wilkins' house is today, with that big rock chimney. Billy Wilkins said that he was told it was remained somewhere in the yard where the old house was. And Captain Poole ran that building and made good money. He was a wealthy man. He was a justice of the peace. And in his estate, he left 800 acres of land in Mecklenburg and 4 on this side of the creek. And that land went from below Hump Williamson's, Betty Williamson's, on the creek. It went all the way up there to Ogilvie Road. And it went all the way down, you know, where James Loftus Farm is, where Wilkins used to live. It included, well, it went up to that, 800 acres. So that's the beginnings of Poole's Mill. The Gregors and the Pooles began running the mill. Then Stanley Haight first comes along. We really don't know where he originated from. Daddy thinks he came from eastern Virginia. They're all Heights in South Hill area in Lunenburg County. Some people think he came from the Valley of Virginia. But Emerald Haight said he compared DNA with people from the Valley of Virginia with Yost Haight and said there's no kin there. But Stanley Haight bought his first land from Frederick Talley in 1786. The Revolution had just ended, 50 acres. And the three of the Talley boys had land, and I'm thinking Frederick was on the south side of the creek. Frederick and Hezekiah, or Hilkiah, and I still can't think of the other one. But anyway, and Obadiah Holmes had a tract next to him. So Stanley Haight started there. We think his wife was Mary or Apostolic Gregory, the daughter of Vincent Gregory, but I can't connect Vincent Gregory with Ambrose Gregory, but I have to believe with him. So Stanley had several children, and his first two sons, the ones that stayed here, were Vincent Haight and Stanley Jr. Stanley Jr. went up to Red Bank, and all the tallies up around Red Bank are mostly descended from Stanley Jr. Vincent stayed here, and I was talking with somebody last week, and they think that Stanley's house was over on the John Haight farm. When you go to the Tom Haight Cemetery behind Lynn Ogley's, if you cross that little branch where Ben Haight built the pond over there, it was an old house. And I went there when I was a little boy, and all I remember was honeysuckle and rock, but it's since been cleared. And the sons were Bedford Haight and Edward Proclus were twins. And then there was Tom Haight, John Haight, and there were girls. Let's see, there was Martha that married Samuel Chandler. There was one married a Calvin, and one married a Elliot. But I'm going to give you the layout of the road. If you go to the mill, and we're standing in Heights Mill Road, where Sadie Heights old White House stands on the road, and going back to Lynn Ogley's, that was the Tom Haight farm. And it came over to a point somewhere where young Zachary Clarke is his name. And there's a line, if you look on the plats today, you can see 4 major properties with a point in the middle of those 4. So that was Tom's place. Bedford Haight had from, let's say, Zachary's place all the way up, including the church cemetery. He had 84 acres. Tom had roughly 120 acres. Proclus Haight, Edward Proclus Haight had on the north side of the road. I haven't really got a handle on where that is, because daughter Martha married Samuel Chandler. They also had land on that side. And Samuel Chandler was Judy Davis's dad. And then John Haight got, as I was telling you, across the creek behind Lynn Ogley's, across the branch. And then the daughter that married Clouden, I think they got land a little further down Possum Road. And I don't know where one married Jones, and I don't know where the Ames got land. But that's where pretty much how Hitesburg got his name. He had so many Heights living along there. And Tom Haight had a bunch of children. He had a bunch of sons. And it was John O. Vincent Height, there was a lawyer Height, and what's another one, Ruth? Of Tom Heights Church. Hell, I had a slew of them. And they, every time somebody got of age to marry, they needed a house. Well, they buy a little land, Robert Height, one of their children. And where Elizabeth Langford is living, I think that house and that little yard has been traded so many times, you can't keep up with it. There were Heights everywhere, and all their kin.
Robert,
Yes, sir.
the Sound Chandler farm is where we live.
Okay.
My granddaddy bought that from Sound Chandler. And, my great-granddaddy buried over there, Edward S. Pike.
Oh, Sam, okay.
Uncle Clovis used to live where Ben lived. And my grandmother Nettie was Clovis's sister. She lived where Elizabeth and Tim lived.
So you're saying Ben lived where who lived?
Uncle Clovis lived there.
Okay, on the left side of the road, where Sadie lived?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I know there was, John had 118 acres on his farm. Edward Crocus got 118 acres as well. And I haven't figured all that out. But you can see why it was from the mill, from the creek all the way up here to the church was all Heights. And they had bukus of children, and they kept on. There was always been a saying I've heard, the Heights had three gifts. They were good with the hands. They were either carpenters or mechanics, and they married hard-working wives. And I've never seen a Height man that didn't marry a hard-working wife. Anyway, Stanley Height accumulated land, Vincent Height accumulated land. Let's see, daughter Sarah married Elliot. Then they had one daughter, the youngest daughter, Vincent Height, who stayed here, and they're buried at behind the Ogleds. Louisa Jane Height, Vincent's youngest daughter, married Mr. Eddie. I think it was Edward A. They had one son, and then her husband died. And there she was with a little boy. His name was Edward A. too. But late in life, he was called Tack A. That's where Dean and Ronnie come in. They was there, what, great-granddad? Yeah. And so Louisa Jane, being a young widow with a child, and she needed a husband, and this young man was looking for a wife. Captain Henry Forlines married Louisa Jane, and then they started to have children. Well, let me back up a little bit. The Forlines came from Powhatan County. Darby Forlines was born in England, and he came to Powhatan, and he married a Tony. And I looked on the cemetery site, there's a Tony out here. And I'm kin to them through my granddaddy Sheppard, not through my grandmama Willie Taylor. Strange enough. But Darby and the Tony woman had a son, Josiah. And, Darby married a Taylor, I think. Well, anyway, let's get that. Yeah, but Josiah married a Tony, and they had a bunch of children. Well, their son, Captain Henry Forlines, was with them. They came, and I've been looking into courthouse, but I haven't figured out where Josiah's land is. But when Captain Henry Forlines married Louisa Jane Height, Vincent Height left some land, or gave some land to them. And it seems that Captain Henry's land was on Possum Road to the west of John Heights. That would go from Peelbone's farm down through, help me out, Jink, it's on your road, all the Freddie Forline's place, Harsley Griffin's, all that land going down to where you turn in to go to the Ogilvie boys. That seems to have been part of Henry Forline's land. And then the other Forline's farm is down where you took me and turned the driveway. The old house is gone. I saw it once upon a time toward the creek. So that's where the Forlines were sitting. And so anyway, here were the Forlines married with the Heights. Well, they had sons, J.C. John Calvin Forlines. He married one of the Height cousins here. AC was Archer Camillus Forlines. He married a white cousin. Josiah Vincent did not become part of this church. He went to the Union Christian Church, and I think he lived until 1954. And then there was one other brother. I forgot about Thomas Frederick Forlines, or Frederick Thompson. He was part of this church. And then there was one brother, Henry Lee. And for whatever reason, he chose to make his living in North Carolina. He went all the way down to Pitt County, around Wilson, Greenville, North Carolina. And that's where the McLaughlin connection came in. Henry Lee Forlines went there to make his living. I don't know what he did down there, but he married a local girl. And then one of their daughters came back and got tangled up with the Clowdens. And people started visiting back and forth between Hitesburg and Pitt County all the time. And that's how Peter Bourne connected with his second wife, because she was a cousin to the Clowdens, but she was of the McLaughlin connection in Pitt County. But come time for the church to be founded, if you look in the church history book, it really sticks out. I can't really see here, but I'll try to do my best. The chairman of the Board of Deacons of Hitesburg Church, I think, was John Calvin. He was also a trustee. I'm supposed to get new glasses in another week. A.C. Forlines was a deacon and a trustee. A.C.'s son George was the treasurer. And Dunlop's granddaddy, Nish Height, was also a trustee. By the way, Nish's name was Archer Cornelius. He was the son of Edward Sam Height, who fought in the War between the states. And so the Forlines really were instrumental. They were going to Aaron Street Church. But I'm just amazed at how they took part in the beginning of the church. They weren't the only ones, but they certainly took a prominent part in helping this church get started. All I can say, they were talented people. When Vincent Height died, I think it was A.C. Forlines was named the administrator of his estate, not one of the Height sons. And also he was appointed by the court to be a commissioner when they were selling the estate. Because many times in the past, when you had large families, no one family member had the money to buy the family farm, or they couldn't agree on terms, so the court would appoint a commissioner and have an auction to come up with the money to buy the farm. I want to go back to what time we still got a half hour to talk about some of the families of this area. We talked about the Tallies owned land down here, and they sold a lot of it. Let's see, everybody in this room is connected with the Tallies would be, Ruth by marriage, Ronnie, Tammy,
My grandma was
Dean,
Italian.
Dean, Don,
Robert.
yeah. So, we're all descended from Tallies. Abraham Talley, the rich man, had all these sons, and we're descended from William Talley. And most of us are descended from William Talley's son, the first Beverly B. Talley. Tammy comes in on maybe Beverly B's sister, I'm not sure. You're not sure? But it's there anyway. But here's how the Tallies and the Heights got along. Sam Talley, Don's great granddad, was married several times. Don's ancestor was an Owen lady. But Sam first married Rebecca Talley. And their descendants include the Bowens over on the Calvary, Scott Bowen, Vince Newton, and all that crowd. Don's granddad Nish married Ada Francis Talley. Stanley Height Jr. married Matilda Talley. My great-great married, Bass Talley married Margaret Ann Height. Then John H. Talley, who's right across the road, up a little bit, up the hill, he married Elizabeth Height. And I probably could go on. The Talleys and the Heights really love one another. Anyway, well, and the strange things that happened. Let me go back to Ambrose Gregory. Now, Ambrose Gregory was Millie Vaughan. She was a smith, but she married Mr. Vaughan and had children, and Mr. Vaughan died. And they lived so close to the White House, and they had a bunch of children, and Captain Stephen Pettigrew's daughter was Millie Vaughan. But prior to marrying Mr. Vaughan, it seems Millie was married to Mr. Gregory, and she had Ambrose. Now, I wish somebody would prove me wrong and show me the evidence to show me that Ambrose Gregory and his wife were not half brother and sister. I hope somebody will show me, because until I see otherwise, I have questions. They appear to have the same mom. Now, you tell me. Strange things can happen. But anyway, I'm going to the Bowen family, because they're connected with this church and with everybody here. Elijah Bowen bought land. I know he bought a piece of land in 1820, and most likely that land is go up Heidi Griffin Trail behind Forrest Forline's house in those woods where Elijah Bowen lived. Now, he had a couple of daughters, but I'm going with the sons because they're most familiar. Son, well, let me back up. Elijah Bowen married Magdalene Sally, Sallee. Magdalene Sally was French Huguenot. Her ancestor was Abraham Sally, who was born in France, came over with the French Huguenots. I guess the Sallys came this way, married Elijah. And Magdalene Sally's mother was Elizabeth Bryant from the French Huguenots. So, David, there's a chance for you yet.
I don't know if I find that shade true.
But anyway, let's go on to Elijah Bowen and his sons. The oldest son was James Bowen. He had a son, James Bryant Bowen. Went up to Red Bank. And you know their descendants, Truett Bowen, Watson Bowen, Harold Bowen, Mason Bowen, all that crowd are descended from James Bowen. Then there's John Bowen. I don't know whether he and William were twins or not, but they appear to be born very close together. John Bowen's descendants include Claude Bowen's mother was a descendant of John Bowen. And also, y'all all remember William David Bowen, Debbie's granddaddy that drove the Model T. His daddy was John W. Bowen, known as Jack, and John W. was the son of John Bowen. Then William Bowen did live in those woods behind Horace Forline's house. He was born in 1812. He was married 4 times. Each wife would die, and he'd keep on marrying. The last wife's grandchild was Herbert Bowen, that was just recently buried. William is supposed to be buried up there, but William's sons, I've gone through Elijah's sons. James went to Red Bank. John stayed over here somewhere. William's oldest son was William Franklin Bowen. He's buried over in Mecklenburg at Bowen Cemetery, but William Bowen's farm was Sam Blanks' farm. That was the very farm that Sam's granddaddy bought, was William Franklin's farm. Then there was a couple of sons that died, and William Franklin's sons that lived were Nathaniel R. Finney and Elizabeth, is that your what? Granddaddy, okay. And Ellis Bowen was your uncle that became the contractor. And then Lenny Bowen was another son that lived, And,
That's my granddaddy.
okay, Bruce's granddaddy. And did he build that house back there, or do you know, the one that Horace lived in?
Yeah, that's where I grew up at.
Who built that house?
Some local people, I think.
Okay, but I didn't know whether Lenny lived there or not.
Yes, he
Okay.
lived there, but I think the neighbors maybe in Ellisbone, because he's a Calvinist.
Okay, and then the other son that lived was George Dallas Bowman. And he married Mary Abigail Good, who was a granddaughter of, I think, from the Stanley Junior Heights. And they went over to Mecklenburg and bought the, George Dallas Bowen died in the 1920s. He was known as Boney Bowen. Everybody in Mecklenburg is aware of him. He bought the farm on Bowen Road. He bought 260 acres from the Davis family. And that's a long story there. The Davis family was in the Chandler family connected, and a bunch of us are kin through the Davis and the Chandlers. But anyway, George Dallas's wife, Abigail, I've seen a picture of her. And I honestly believe that's where the Bowen eyes came from. Think about Wallace Bowen Sr., Wallace Bowen Jr., Tony Powell, all they have prominent eyes. I think that's where it came from, was Abigail. So that kind of fills us in on Bowens, except George Dallas's oldest son was Claude Bowen's dad, John Franklin. And John Franklin is supposed to have built that little house that Martha Simplicity owns right down the hill from her. And I was told that that was a replica of the Davis house that was sitting where Randolph Heights Margin home is. And when Dallas Bowen bought that farm, that he lived there for a while, and then later he built the house where his son, what's the younger son, lives sitting there now. So that was George Dallas's oldest son, John Franklin, Claude's dad. The next son was George Edward Bowen, and he married Bessie Bowen, who was a daughter of Jinx. Your Aunt Bessie, was she a sister to your mama?
Yeah.
Okay.
Bessie was Bill Bowen's mother.
So she married George Edward Bowen, and they bought the 84 acres that Bedford Heights had. So they bought from Peyton for real, I think, but anyway, that's 84 acres. And we know that young Michael wants to fix up that house, and nobody knows when that house was built. I'd like to know. And who was living there when it was built. We may never know.
Well, Bedford Heights lived there because he's buried down there.
Yeah. Did he live in that
I don't
house?
know whether he built it or not.
We don't know. I'd love to know. But anyway, I've covered a lot of ground here.
George is the one that donated land to the cemetery.
Yes. And I understand that he was quite a progressive farm. There's more information. Does anybody have questions? I'll turn it over to y'all now. I've
I
tried
don't
to,
have a question, but
Yes,
I have
sir.
a little tidbit.
go,
that
you
should know
go
about.
right ahead.
My great-granddaddy, Edward S., was in the Civil War. And one spring, he took a leave from the army and came home to find a crop for his family. He went back and served out his time, and when the armistice was signed up at Appomattox, he walked home.
And I've seen a picture of him, and he's sitting there, and he has got the most enormous hands I ever saw. Since you mentioned him, I'll tell you something about your granddad. Remember I told you Ambrose Gregory built the mill, then he turned it over to his son-in-law, Stephen Poole. Well, Stephen died about the 1850s. He had a bunch of children. The first son to manage the mill in the 800-acre estate was George Poole. It's on the Civil War map, George Poole's mill. He ran it for some 10 years or so, and for whatever reason, he decided to retire from the mill, and he moved toward Clarke. His next brother, I don't know if it's Edward or Edmund, I think it's Edmund F. Poole, had gone to Nashville, Tennessee, become a rabbi, standing medical doctor. He came back here and ran the estate and the mill. And I don't know how long he ran it, but they had another son, Captain Stephen had sons George, the doctor, Edmund Franklin, and then another son, William. They were all other sons, but they didn't stick around. William Poole lived across from Tony Powell on Poole's Mill Road. If y'all remember, there used to be an old stucco house, two-story house, that you can't see falling down on Poole's Mill Road. Not that house, I don't think. That was where William Poole lived. He owned 500 acres there. And William Poole's had several sons. The first one disappeared. And one of his sons was Thomas Carr Poole, who built the house where Dennis Bill Owen lives now. And Thomas Carr had son Stephen, who lived on 58, and Flournoy, who was Jerry Poole's granddad. So there's a progression. But this was Poole's mill for over 100 years. Now, my great John Hyde worked there, as did everybody else's great. They all worked at the mill, but the Pooles owned it until the late 1800s, early 1900s. It's time for the family to settle the estate, the huge estate. So Thomas Carr Poole brings a chancery seat. He put it up for auction. Dr. Andrew Easler of Clarksville had money. He bought the entire Poole estate, the 800 acres plus the mill down here. He started selling off land. He sold some, probably to Claude Bowen's dad. He sold land to the Tucks and so forth. And then about 1904 or 5, he sells the mill in I guess the 30 acres, whatever went with it. Maybe 4 acres at the time on this side of the creek. He sold the mill to Thomas Carr Poole. So he got back his daddy's and his granddaddy's mill. And Thomas Carr also had the mill at what we call Pooleville, Highway 58, which Thomas Carr's daddy, William, was already running and had a foundry up there. And I also found out that Thomas Carr apparently owned the mill down where Phyllis's folks lived, down there in the edge of Granville County. He owned it for a short while before your folks took it over. I found the deeds in 1911. A young man by the name of Nish Hite, Don's granddaddy, was already working at the mill. And the mill was then owned by both of the Poole brothers, Stephen from Highway 58 and Flournoy up at Hico. And in 1911 deed, Stephen sold his half interest in the sawmill, the grist mill, and the 30 acres to Nish Hite. In 1917, Brother Flournoy Poole sold his half interest in 30 acres in the mills to Nish. So by 1917, your granddad owned the whole thing. And then
We don't know the history of the dam. Nobody got a history of the dam.
well, but anyway, I know I've covered a lot of ground, and for those who not kin, I know haven't been here long, I apologize, but that's basically the history of Hitesburg. If anybody else has anything to add, you're welcome to
I
it.
have a question.
Yes,
Is
ma'am.
the Petty Pool been shortened to just Pool?
Yes, there's two ways to look at that. One story is when they were passing, the Crown was passing their grants, Seth Pettipool, we know he got a 500 acre grant under the name Seth Pettipool. Somebody suggested that he went to, don't know whether he had to go to the Lunenburg courthouse or where he went on. I don't, Halifax wasn't even there then, and got another grant under the name of Seth P. Poole, P apostrophe Poole. We don't know if that's true or not, but obviously over the years it got shortened to P. Poole. When you went to the clerk of the court for any deed or marriage or anything, whoever's the clerk that day is writing your names down, and that's why all the names have, you have, at the top of the deed, you have one spelling of your last name, down in the middle, at the bottom, the clerk spells your name another way. It happens. But over the years, it got much easier to drop it to P. Poole. And I think they kept Petty Poole up through, say, William Poole in the mid-1800s. Thomas Carr Poole started off as P apostrophe pool, and then eventually they dropped it to pool. However, I just looked tonight, there's a grave site of a man out in Kentucky, western Kentucky, who only died within the last 20 years. They still go by the name Pettipool. Let me tell you something. I didn't mention in the Hite family, Vincent Haight's daughter, Prudence, married James R. Blanks. And they went to Trigg County, Kentucky, which is in far southwestern Kentucky. They had children out there. She died and was buried out there. And J.R. and his children moved back here. And one of their sons was Nathaniel Vincent. And there was a bunch of children. And that's how Tam is connected to the Heights through the Blankses and the Garville connection. But all the Blankses, Sam Blanks is direct descendant of Vincent Nathaniel Blanks. And those people went to Kentucky and came back here before the Civil War. That is some kind of trip, horse and wagon, to go all the way from here to Lee County, Virginia, to the end of Kentucky. And if you look up in the cemeteries in Christian County, Kentucky, where Hopkinsville, Trigg County, and there's another county on the corner of Illinois, that must have been the promised land, but people love to go there. The Tallons, the Pools, the Ogilvies, and Wilkinsons, they all just flocked up there to Kentucky. And of course, a few of them stayed here. Any other questions?
But I will say, if y'all have a family reunion, have Robert come speak at it, because he did at ours one time, and wealth of information, we thought we knew about our thing.
Well, I put it like this. This is just something I grew up with from my daddy, his Aunt Jetty, and it's just something I love to do. But I hope this has been something to give you insight.
Have you found out how Ian is keen to us?
No. Ronnie, you have something?
I don't know, 20 years ago, Robin and Scott transferred over to Hopkinsville, Kentucky. So Deborah and I went out there to visit them one time. We got there a couple of hours before they got home from work. So we were just killing time and went in a Staple or some kind of office store there, just browsing. And we bought a little something. And anyway, the clerk there found out where we were from. I guess maybe from credit card, I don't know. But she was a talker, and she got talking. She wanted to know where we were from. And bottom line is her family was from Buffalo Springs.
Mhm.
They migrated there in the 1800s.
And there were plenty of them too. These families back in the 1800s, they didn't know anything about birth control, to be honest with you, and they had enormous families. And I guess there wasn't enough land for them to,
We needed a lot, they needed a lot of labor too, free labor.
yes, they did. But Carl reminded me, Sylvester Ogled, your ancestor, and Jinx's ancestor, had a farm supposed to be between Ernst Creek Church and Ernst Creek. That would put somewhere on Bill Owen's land. And Sylvester's father, one of the Peter Ogilvie's land was on the north side of the road. So there's a lot of history here. Well, I'm about through unless somebody else has something to offer.
I got one question.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm confused about Heights Mill and Pools Mill. Is it two different meals or the same meal?
It was Pools Mill. I'll put it in reference. This is how they described it in the deed books. The one up at Highway 58, and some of you remember on Highway 58 when you rounded the curve and you look at Bill Owen's house, and remember when Phil Pereira was living on the left-hand side of the road? That little thicket between Bill Owen's pasture and Phil Pereira's yard, there was a little log house. That was the Poolville Post Office, which mail was carried to there by the Pullets in their early days in the 1900s. It was called Poolville because of the Pool family. So the mill down there that the Sizemores later took up, that was Pool's lower mill because it was down the creek. And that's where the foundry was. Right down the road here was Pool's upper mill. It was because it was upstream. But as I said, in 1911 and 17, it became Heights Mill when Dish Height bought it.
Well, then the other mill up here, the next one, that was Poole's mill too, right?
The one at, the Steel Bridge?
Yeah.
Yes, think about it, that was Ogilvie's mill. I found the deed where David B. Tyler Senior and his wife Emily bought that 153 acres or so, or 150 acres in roughly 1853 from Robert Yancey Ogled, who was the rich Ogled at the White House. He owned the world. So it was Ogilvie's mill first. But I don't doubt that the Tallers may have had a mill right before the Ogilvies, because the Tallers had land along there on both sides before Robert Yancey Ogled owned it.
During my lifetime, I always called it O'Gary's mill.
Well, I think that's because the Dennis O'Gary and his family probably ran it one time.
Then the other one up on, 49, and then another one up in North Carolina.
And I've also heard it called Willard's Mill. I don't know which Willard ran it. And I also saw where George Bowen bought Apple's Mill, but at the same time he bought this farm over here.
Apple's mill is on 49, this is Wood's mill over here.
Mhm.
Mr. Spaulding worked at both of those mills.
Which are, I know he worked at House Mill, which other one did he work?
One on 49.
Oh, okay.
And my granddaddy was the one that ran the O'Gary's mill,
Mhm.
great granddaddy. He came from Ireland,
Well, that was Dennis O'Gary.
yes.
And he is buried in the Captain Stephen Thedpool Cemetery behind Wilford Elliott's. I don't know why he's buried there, but he is, supposedly.
And he built him down there, because I was born in those old cabins.
Oh, okay.
It's fascinating.
Well, any other comments?
Good job,
Well, thank you.
You put a lot of work into that.
Excuse my man.
Well,
When you cross the bridge going into South Boston, on 501, going through Rock Cove up there, Wilson's granddaddy built that.
Okay.
Granddaddy.
And I found out Elizabeth descended from the Wilkersons as well. Abraham, would you close us in prayer, please?
Heavenly Father, thank you for the services we've had today, and thank you for the information Robert has given. Although we might have not have known it, we all can, through this church, justify it. Lord God, forgive us of our sins. Watch over us and care for us. Lord God, do what's best with Ukraine and Russia. Protect us. Protect the people over there. Lord God, guide those leaders. Help them to see that you can stop it when you want to.